Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. This is our second day. I'm Jamie Mochik with the Nicolay Federated Library System in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and on behalf of myself and the 14 other Wisconsin systems who helped sponsor this event, we are glad you are here. As I said, we had 5 sessions yesterday. They were excellent. I'm guessing those of you who listened in would agree with that, and I know we're going to have 5 excellent sessions today, and we're going to kick it off with our first presenter being Pat Wagner of Pattern Research Incorporated, based out of Denver, Colorado, and I'm sure many of you have heard of her either on the web or in person. She is always wildly popular, so we were very happy that she was available to present on the topic of complaining more effectively. So Pat, whenever you are ready.
Great. And Jamie, thank you so much for inviting me. And it's nice to kind of look out at the audience today. I see some old friends from the area, and I always encourage people, you can still move and sit up front if you want. The topic today is Stop the Whining, How to Complain Effectively. And one of the things that's maybe think about the key idea for today is complaining effectively is not the same as whining. And I wanted to tell you before we get started where this program came from. Years ago, and I'm sure that you've seen this happen before, one of my clients, not in Wisconsin, another very famous state, one of my clients was going through a very difficult public issue having to do with libraries, and the staff was buzzing with problems and issues and so on, and at some point a well-intended but ill-informed board member issues an edict through the newspapers telling people that they can't complain anymore. Well, this is America. That didn't go over very well, and what we had to do was to try to work with people about what's the difference between complaining effectively and whining, and really how it hurts you, hurts the career, hurts your job, hurts your credibility with people, and at the same time, of course, hurts your library. However, there is such thing as complaining effectively. For those of you who haven't worked with me before, I've been working as a trainer and consultant for libraries throughout North America since 1978, speaking at various places. In fact, for those of you watching this live today, I will be at ALA in Chicago in a week doing some programs on job hunting. And having gone to high school here in Wisconsin, proud graduate of Tremper High School in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and have lived in Milwaukee for many years before I moved out to Denver, I have been a frequent visitor to Wisconsin libraries, to your state association and so on, and have worked with most of the systems as well. For people who are interested, the images that we're using today come from pixabay.com, which is a great free resource for art and photos for any kind of presentation you might like to do, and this is the only attribution they request. So I want to thank the folks at Pixabay. Several things we hope happen today. First of all, out of the program, that we really think that we want you to kind of pause before you try to make changes in your library and really do research so that you go into the situation knowing how decisions are actually made. We also want you to feel more effective, more competent and confident when you have to solve problems, regardless of what your position is. And that's something that we want to emphasize today. You might be a library director or a trustee. You might be a part-time page. You might be tech services. You might be in reference or cataloging. But regardless of your position, how to be more influential. And also, again, regardless, of your position, we want you to be able to grow your reputation as a leader. And what that means is that we want you to be someone that people are more likely to listen to, take seriously, and have more influence and impact in your library and in the larger community and institution that your library serves as well. So there are several main things what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit, first of all, about why people whine. And, of course, there's lots of different theories, so you get to hear my favorite ones. Second, when there is a problem that needs discussion and action in your library, how to talk about the problem. And I'll tell you that this is an anti-venting program, that there's a big difference between venting about a problem, which is whining and next to useless, and actually talking about it in such a way as it gives the message to other people that you're a problem solver. Then we all have to look in the mirror. One of the first things I do for people when they come to me and say, here's this kind of horrible thing going on in our library and I want to be one of the people who fixes it, guess what? We first have to think about how we can become more influential by making sure that we have our act together as well. Then some of the ways to analyze the issue as well. And I mean, I know you folks are experienced problem solvers yourself, but this is a reminder that if it's really an important issue to you, it deserves your attention, it deserves your intelligence, it deserves your discipline, and it also deserves a little bit of time. Most of the stuff that I deal with libraries is not life and death crisis, and unless it involves something that is a life and death issue. So we do have a time to take a breath and kind of look at it. Also, even though that in typical problem solving this comes sooner, we all going to devote a little bit of a section to the question of who will fix the problem. And I want to pause a moment and share a story that happened to me a few years ago in Colorado. And in addition to my work with universities and libraries and schools, I also work with local government and nonprofits. And I was running a community meeting for the elected officials in a small community in Colorado, about 5,000 people. And it was an open forum where people from the public could talk about problems they were having, and the city council was there, and the county commissioners, everyone was there, hopefully to answer questions. And one very irate woman stood up and started talking about the highway in front of her rural townhouse and how upset she was about how the highway was in such disrepair and it didn't get snow removal appropriately in the winter, and there were big potholes, and the edges of the highway were crumbling, and so she vented for about 5 minutes. And the elected officials on the podium sat, took notes, listened very respectfully. I was very proud of them. And then at the end of her tirade, and it was a tirade, the head of the city council said, Mrs. Smith, first of all, we thank you for coming, and we actually agree with you 100%. Here's the problem. That's a state highway. We have no legal or financial authority over it. In fact, if we tried to fix it, we'd get in trouble. But we would be more than happy to give you the name of the official in Denver who you can talk to about getting it fixed. And she sort of looked around a little embarrassed and went, never mind, and sat down. They didn't want to embarrass her, for sure, and they let her have her say. But wouldn't it have been too nice if she had maybe done a little research beforehand, and we had electricity at the time, and there was the worldwide internet, so she could have kind of looked it up. So let's make sure we know who actually has the legal and financial authority to fix the problem. And then finally, what do they need to fix the problem from us? And that's something that we sometimes don't think about. We don't put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are trying to fix the problem. Sometimes we have bad thoughts about them. It's sometimes in the middle of a problem, it's hard to have empathy for the people who we think have power because it's so obvious to us there's a problem. Why don't they just drop everything and do what it is that we need them to do? So we're going to talk a little bit about what they need as well. So first of all, let's see about what people do when they whine. And by the way, these are Wisconsin flamingos, in case anyone was concerned about that. But they're happy Wisconsin flamingos. Well, why are people doing it? Well, you know what? First of all, other people are doing it. And this is really a shout out to supervisors, managers, and leaders out there that if you are complaining ineffectively and whining in front of your employees, you are giving them permission to whine. And I have to say, I rarely, it's not impossible, but I rarely see a situation where employees are whining that I don't hear whining supervisors and managers as well. And remember, whining is ineffective complaining. The second thing is, and I understand this 100%, I know that people whine when they don't know what to do to get what it is they actually want. They actually don't know how to ask for what they want. They don't know how to write the letter, send the email, have the meeting, make the phone call. They don't know the protocol. So one thing that I try to do in places where whining seems to be epidemic, I make sure that any of the grievance policies that are part of that particular institution are up to date, published. And I'll tell you, I like to have a yearly meeting where everyone gets together for a meeting with personnel and a personnel attorney who can explain to staff what the rules are, what the policies are for who you contact if there's a problem, what the process is for filing a grievance. And I have facilitated a number of those over the years. I don't run them. I'm not the one who talks because I'm not a lawyer. But you know what? I can't remember one that we did that people didn't come up afterwards to myself and the director and thank us and say, we didn't know this stuff. We didn't even know what to ask. And it's so good. You can't just thrust that personnel manual in people's faces and say, here's what you need to know, and walk away. And we invite tough questions at those sessions. Now, sometimes, and of course this does not apply to anyone at this program today, but sometimes people want change without them taking personal responsibility for stepping up. You know, people are constantly talking about there's retribution and I don't want to be a whistleblower, but you know, my experience, and again, I've been doing this for 35 years for hundreds of libraries and universities across the country, I can only think of 2 incidents in all those years where the person did receive real retribution. In fact, I had an experience with the library in the Midwest in another famous state, not Wisconsin, where I was called in and the staff told me that there was retribution for complaints that had been made about a new reorganization, and people had been demoted because of that. Then I met with management and said, oh, we're going through a whole bunch of changes here, and we have had to restructure how people are paid so that we were able to do this and not change how much they make today, but we had to change their job descriptions. And the truth is this will allow them to go up the ladder and will allow for future raises, but we had to do it this way according to the state personnel system. So I've run through enough of those to know that this issue of secret retribution isn't as big as people say. But it's not just that. It's that people sometimes want to be that stealth person. It's a kind of bullying, to be honest with you. And when I first saw it is when I was learning to be a performer in Milwaukee many years ago, and I learned very quickly how to deal with people who would sort of bully you from the audience, right? Would make comments and so on. What I found out very quickly is they counted on a dark auditorium to be able to yell at you and say nasty things to you, right? Cat calls and such. And all you had to do to stop it was to turn on the lights. Or, if it was appropriate, actually walk down into the auditorium and stand next to the person, introduce yourself, shake your hand, and say, so, you're upset with what I said up there. Here's your mic. Why don't you go ahead and explain why you're upset? And you know what? Almost every single time that person shut up and sat down. So what we find is that there are some people out there who love to play, oh, I can't do anything, but they take pot shots in the dark. And then finally, and this is actually a fairly benign reason that people whine, is that for some people it's a way of getting attention. Ooh, I've got the big gossip. Ooh, I've got the crazy thing. But on the other hand, it's also a way of social bonding in our species. People like to get together and talk about complaints and problems and so on. And what I suggest to people is that the reason that things like national football, right, sports, Hollywood, the British royal family, those things were invented so we could complain about something and not hurt people. So if you want to get attention for hot gossip, let's talk about the latest scandal in Hollywood, or, hey, the Super Bowl's coming up, and Denver and Green Bay didn't make it this time. We were hoping for a matchup in our family, to be honest with you. Those are the things that we should use. We should talk about accomplishment and the good things. That's how we should get attention and bond with our colleagues. Whining after a while brings out the worst in people. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but these are some of the things that I have noticed about people who whine, and maybe you have some ideas as well. We're going to go through a couple of more slides, and then we're going to stop and see if people have any questions or concerns. So what else? Well, sometimes it's a way of putting off making that very hard decision. It is typical that people will talk about decisions and actions before making them, but some people never make the decision. And sometimes you just want to say, well, do something. You've been talking about it for weeks or months or even years. Maybe it's time to do something as well. Now, this next one is something we run into a lot with, and we learned, first of all, from friends of ours who worked as therapists and counselors, is that sometimes we want everything and everyone around us to change except ourselves. And the first time I heard about this was from my dad, who at the beginning of his career was a general practitioner in a medical clinic on the south side of Chicago. And he said the biggest frustration for him as a doctor is telling people that they had to change their diet and exercise, they had to take their medication to get better. And they would tell him, no, doc, just do something magic. I just want you to give me a pill today or give me a shot. But I'm just going to keep drinking and eating the wrong foods and so on, but I want my health to change. And that's not how it works. And the same thing is true particularly with the more serious situations that you might have to encounter at your library, that things probably aren't going to change unless you're willing to do something differently. And this is the sad one, and I have been there, folks, and I understand what this is like. We feel helpless in the face of authority. We don't believe the people in power care. Well, first of all, I find, having worked with the people in power over the years, that 99.9999% of the time they really do care, but guess what? Sometimes they don't know what to do. Sometimes they are being told to do things from above the food chain that they are legally not allowed to tell anyone, including their employees and coworkers, what's going on. Sometimes there are rules and laws. I went through a situation with some of my employees last year, and I actually brought out the statute from the state of Colorado because I said we have to change what we're doing because they've changed the law. And we were all unhappy, but I had to say, this is something I'm helpless. I've talked to our accountant and our payroll clerks and so on. We have to figure out if we can do a legal and ethical workaround. So I believe that most of the time people in power actually do care. They may not have the resources. They may be too close to the situation, and we don't know what people above them in the food chain are saying. But that general feeling of helplessness is something that some people feel inside all the time. It paralyzes them. So some authors actually think that whining and complaining all the time is also a sign of helplessness. People who feel competent and confident, I've noticed, really don't complain very much. They just go and fix whatever it is they want and then go back and do it. But there's other people who, even when they do have the ability to fix something, they don't do it. Now, what's very funny, and I ran into this in the state of Texas a few years ago, I was working with a university library, and one of the reasons they brought me in is they had been having a problem at the executive level about making a big decision about where a big piece of the new collection was going to go, that what the decision was going to be made. And they had identified 3 places in their big, huge university building where these hundreds, thousands of books were going to be, and it was going to be disruptive and so on, and they had to make the decision. So I came in, sat down with the executive team, and the dean was there and everyone, and finally the assistant dean kind of like broke out almost in tears, and she said, I'm so frustrated that we haven't made a decision about this in 6 months. We have to make this decision. It's costing us money. So I just looked at the dean, and I said, okay, dean, We have everybody in the room. Who's the person who has the legitimate authority to make that decision? And the dean laughed and pointed to the woman who was complaining and said, Mary, it's been your decision to make this whole time, and I told you that. You could right now make the decision on your own, and the rest of us will live with it. Well, she practically fell out of her chair because she backed up so much. You know, when you say something to people and they kind of lean back like, oh my goodness, she kind of leaned back, nearly fell over backwards in the chair, and then went, oh, I don't want to make the decision. Everyone laughed. It was a very good humored group. And you know what? By the end of the hour, we had made the decision about what happens. So we have to be careful about this idea of being helpless, because often it's our excuse for not actually finding out the facts. So before we talk about the next section, I just want to check and see if, Jamie, are there any questions that have come in from the audience so far?
No, I'm not seeing anything. So
Okay.
we have had some discussion in the chat box a little bit, but yeah, not any questions so far. So
okay,
free to keep going.
Great. Thank you very much, and we'll check in again in about 20 minutes. So one idea that I hope that you take away today is that whining is contagious, and you can stop it. At least stop it at your point in the node in the network in your office, that you deciding that you're not going to be the one who complains ineffectually anymore can have a big impact, not just on your employees, but your coworkers, your bosses, and even the people who come to the library who you serve. So next thing we want to do is, how do you talk about the problem? How does someone talk about a problem effectively? Now, there are some things on this list, and by the way, I am guilty of every one of these things, so I'm not saying like, nah, I'm better than anyone. But there are some ways we make things worse. The first and foremost is we exaggerate. And I'm a storyteller, and I grew up in a family of storytellers. And my mother used to say that nobody in this family tells the truth because we're all adding little details. But when I'm talking about real problems in my life and so on, I have learned, for better or for worse, that understatement works much better than overstatement. That thing about making sure you are not saying anything that isn't absolutely the truth really is important, because it has to do with your credibility. I would say, for example, that my husband, who's from the planet Vulcan and a truth teller, has enormous credibility with his customers, the people he serves, and the people he works with on projects all over the world, because people trust him to tell the truth. And they know that if he says, you know, the door was blue, the door was blue. If he says there were 3 people in the room, there were 3 people in the room. So this is where we don't want to exaggerate for effect. By the same token, we don't want to escalate things. Now, this is hard for me because I have sort of a combative nature. And, you know, like I will tend to toe the line and go, oh, yeah, right? So escalation is important, that we don't want to make things worse. And as I said, no embellishment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how to keep that down. Inaccuracy, not checking the facts. You know, in my job as a consultant, there's a big part of my work that's pretty simple, and that is somebody will say, we have a problem because X, Y, Z, and I want to see the piece of paper where it says X, Y, and Z. What are the actual facts? Sometimes it means looking up foundation documents from the court and recorder's office. Sometimes it means making a phone call to someone who has been, quote, accused of saying something, and see if they'll go on the record and verify that or not. And it's amazing how many times you find that the people in the room are operating by feelings and opinions, but not the facts. So checking the facts is very important, and boy, this is a big thing that you can do to help heal the culture of your library, is to making it an absolute rule that you will not share information either in conversations or online or social media unless you have checked the fact. And checking a fact means something that you can point to, not just something that's a feeling in people's heads. And finally, generalizations. And so we're going to take a look at what those mean now practically when we're talking about that we don't want to make things worse. So what we're trying to do, for better for worse, is reduce the drama. I know a drama is addictive. It's wonderful to walk into a workplace and say, oh, let me tell you the terrible things that happened today. And I am guilty of it as anyone else. But when you're actually working with a workplace and trying to make things better in that workplace, we want to reduce the drama. Save the drama for a Thanksgiving dinner where you're sitting around the table telling awful stories about Uncle Fred. That's okay to have drama there, but not in the workplace. So how do you become the voice of reason? Well, as we've said before, only repeat what is true. And what is true absolutely means that there is physical evidence in the form of a document. Just because you can say, to the best of my knowledge, this is what I heard someone say. But remember, in courts of law in the West, we call that hearsay. And unless you've somehow missed the last 25 years and have never seen an episode of Law and Order, understand how much is thrown out of a courtroom because it is not something that is physical evidence that someone can include. And just because somebody told it to you doesn't mean it's true. In fact, just because a trusted friend told you doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So when we're talking about things, we want to avoid embellishment. So we are going to try to literally avoid adjectives and adverbs, anything that dresses up the situation. We're going to take out all the snide remarks about things. We also want to avoid abstractions, and abstractions are things like, she didn't trust me. What does it mean not to trust a person? Well, trust is a big, huge room. It's like a bomb that goes off when someone says, I don't trust you. And it makes it very difficult to continue when people have said that. So I tell people that there are things that I am trustworthy about, and there's things I am not trustworthy about. For example, anybody in this audience could give me the bank deposit to their library or to their home, and you would be able to trust me to get to the bank on time, and you could trust me that every single penny in that bank envelope would get into the bank regardless of how much. You can trust me to do that. You know what you can't trust me to do is clean your house. I am terrible when it comes to housekeeping. So you don't want to trust me to clean your house, but you can certainly trust me with a large amount of money. Instead of using the word trust, we could say that we assign Pat the job of cleaning the break room, and we came back 3 hours later, and it looked like as if it had not been touched, and there was still the dust in the empty coffee cups, and so on. So that is what we mean by a concrete description. It has the absolute detailed description of what happened instead of saying, she doesn't respect me or she doesn't trust me. And then finally, mostly the voice of reason is about numbers. And I want to add numbers in context. So when we say, for example, that circulation went down, it helps to say circulation went down 13% based on the numbers that we had on January 1st of 2014. However, those numbers on circulation only included books and did not include e-books, games, or any kind of technology or DVDs or CDs. It didn't include any of the downloads that came from our website, because someone might say, well, the numbers are down, and quote the extent to which those circulation numbers are down without giving people the bigger picture as well. And I noticed, too, that one of the reasons people like my husband garner so much respect from other people is how calm he is, even when he's sharing bad news to a customer. So let me give you these 5 ideas. These are, and I've helped you a little bit by coloring in the words that would basically be trigger words that would cause the situation to be, let's say, escalating because of the words. And I'm going to show you this sheet, and then we're going to take a minute, give you a chance to think about how you might translate that into Vulcan. And then I'm going to give you what each of these look like and sound like if they really are translated into something that is calmer. So if, for example, how many times do we hear people say, oh, she just ignored me? I walked into the break room, or I walked up to the service desk and so-and-so ignored me. And, of course, notice when I say it, I emphasize the word ignore. Or the mayor hates libraries. The state legislature hates libraries. The people at the school district hate libraries. That guy on radio hates libraries. Everybody hates libraries. Boy, that gets us all fired up. And isn't it fun to have enemies? No one likes the new collection policy. Oh, I've been in so many rooms where people, in arguing about a new policy or protocol, will say no one likes it. And by the way, one of the ways I deal with that is I say, great, let's have a list. And I remember being in New Mexico, and I was facilitating a meeting of a local nonprofit organization, and the mayor was there and representatives from a whole bunch of different groups. And the mayor, who was a little bit of a bully in my opinion, stood up and said, well, I think I can speak from all my colleagues in the room to say that no one supports this new program that we're planning to do. And there was a pause in the room, and I looked around and I said, well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. What we're going to do now is poll the audience one at a time. And he got very red in the face and sat down and glared at me for the next hour. And we went around the entire room, and guess what? Most of the people in the room actually did support the new policy. They were just intimidated by what the mayor said. When he did it again about 30 minutes later and said, I think I speak for everyone, and I'm thinking, you're just like asking for it, fellow. So I put on my nice consultant smile and I said, thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. And once again, let us poll your colleagues here on the board who all have the legal right for their opinion and vote. And again, everybody said, no, we don't necessarily think this. And by the third time that he tried to do it, there was a mutiny in the room. And the whole, I would say the flavor of the room changed. People were participating, having a good time. And it was pretty funny because after everyone was gone, one of the people on the board came up and said, you realize you have made an enemy for life with the mayor and you will never be invited back again. And I said, yeah, I kind of figured that out when he stopped looking at me about 20 minutes ago. But I'm always careful about that. No one. That's an example of a generalization. Another one is everyone is upset about the changes in hours, right? No one, everyone. And then, and this is the sad one, is my experience means nothing to the board. And that's something you hear a lot these days because of times of change, where everything is being changed. One way, by the way, that I deal with that when someone is talking about how their professionalism is being impugned or that they are experiencing demotion or the 20 years that I have served this library means nothing because look at the changes. One of the things I ask people, I say, so do you feel that you're being singled out? And you know what? Most people are good people and basically honest. Most of the time when I ask that question, the person pauses and thinks and says, well, no, not exactly. I guess I'm not being singled out. And I said, well, you know, your experience is based on what you've done the last 20 years, which is really important. We're not talking about the past, we're talking about the future. And I have to say, just as a secret between you and me, now that I'm in my mid-60s, one of the reasons that I don't dye my hair, change my hair color, is I find having as much silver as I do in my hair right now gives me a little credibility. So when someone says my experience means nothing, I said, yeah, I know what you mean. I've been doing this 30 plus years, and you know what? The way I did things in 1980, 1990, the year 2000, even the year 2010, doesn't necessarily apply to what's needed today in 2015, and change is happening rapidly. So I think my experience does mean something, but that's not the point. So, okay, how would you translate these things into something that were statements that were maybe more effective? Well, instead of saying that the person did not, who ignored me, let's say, the person did not speak to me. She might have had 100 reasons why she didn't speak to me. It was today. She didn't speak to me for one of those reasons. Maybe she didn't hear me. Maybe she was involved with something. I mean, who knows? But not necessarily that she ignored me. The mayor hates libraries. Well, how about the city has a 10% shortfall? I saw our last mayor, who was a avid book lover and library lover, have to make some serious cuts in the budget for the city and for the library, and it had nothing to do with him loving or hating libraries. It's just that our city got hit very badly by the recession, and suddenly we were millions and millions of dollars short. So guess what? Everybody took a hit. I might say that no one likes the new collection policy. What I'm really saying is I don't like the new collection policy. And it's another way that people hide behind words, right? They hide behind the we so they don't have to say the I. By the same token, everyone is upset about the change in hours? No, I'm upset about the change in hours. And finally, my experience means nothing to the board. Well, I might not get the promotion. And that's a different thing. And also, it gets closer to the, if I want to get the promotion, is there something that I need to be doing differently? So we've identified the fact that we have great power in how we say things to affect how problems are solved. But now we have to look at ourselves. And again, when people come to me and say, I need advice because things aren't going in our library the way that we might be, I say, well, look at yourself first. So these are some of the concepts that we talk about when someone is trying to improve their credibility. What I tell people is you really have to be the employee of the month. You really have to be good and not act out. And some of the words we talk about is, are you seen already as trustworthy and reliable? That if you're given something to do, you do it. If somebody tells you something, you follow through. What does it mean to be trustworthy and reliable? So you want to be trustworthy and reliable, especially in the eyes of the people who make decisions and take action. Are you a self-starter and proactive? That's something I hear a lot from directors and boards and managers about. The people they tend to favor are the ones that they don't have to ask to do everything. A library director I worked with a few years ago had this great phrase. He said, don't come to me and tell me that somebody dropped the ball. I expect you to go pick up the ball yourself. I'm very proud of the people who have worked for us over the years. They were all self-starters. They were all people who anticipated problems, who would look up from work and see the bigger picture. Another thing is, are you a low-maintenance person? Are you someone who's good-humored on bad days? Are you easy to communicate with? Do people not have to worry about tiptoeing around you if there's a problem? Those things, I think, are very important in terms, again, of building your credibility in the community, that people have to say, it's comfortable going to Pat even if Pat's having a bad day. And then the whole thing of being hardworking and productive. You know, sometimes when things aren't going well in a workplace, you see the person who's kind of wandering around with the coffee cup. You wonder how much time they have. And they seem to have time to stop at every desk and every department to talk about what's going on. It is natural and very human that during times of stress, our productivity drops some. We're distracted. There's lots of other things coming in that make us that are important and so on. But nonetheless, we were talking about a situation with a client a couple of days ago with a client from Washington State, a head of training, and the head of training was talking about one of the employees at the library, and he said, this person is the consummate professional, and even though I know he's having a hard time right now because of the big changes we're going through with the new director, he's still being able to maintain his level of productivity. Don't you think that person is more likely to have the ear of the people in charge than the person who's wandering around with the coffee cup? So if you'd like to, while we're going through this, if you want to add to the chat room, what are some of the qualities that you think a person should be careful about maintaining? Let's assume they already have these qualities, even when things are tough. You know, so what would you add to this particular list? And we're going to go ahead, so please feel free to side chat. Another thing, and this is something that I had to learn because it was not part of my nature, one of the times that you should just shut up. Let's kind of censor ourselves in the best way. Let's discipline ourselves. And there are many different forms for this. You can find it in many different books and so on. This is one that I got from a religious magazine that I've always liked. Is what you're about to say productive? it actually helps fix something? Does it contribute to the solution? Is it ideas? Is it something positive? Does it support other people's success in solving the problem? And is it something that if you say, you never are going to worry about regretting saying it? If it's recorded, if it gets out on email or so on. Now, I've made some big mistakes in my life, not understanding when the time is to be quiet. And this is one of the things I want to say to people. I'm not telling you not to complain or to ignore problems that need to be solved. But how you talk about those problems will have impact, not just for the problem, but as I've said before, your own credibility and your own career. A number of years ago, we're talking now almost 20 years ago, I was doing a strategic planning session for a state library. And we had about 100+ people in the room from all walks of life, and a lot of them were people who were pretty high up in their particular organization. And because it was a state library, there were people from all different kinds of libraries, from library schools, but also from the Department of Education and just a whole bunch of different groups. So we were in the room, and a woman stood up, and she was very upset about something. She happened to be a children's librarian, and she basically vented for about 5 minutes to the group about how upset she was, and she pointed to the man, that a particular state representative was in the room, because she was upset that he was allowed a voice because he was, quote, a technocrat who all he cared about technology and didn't care about children. And she ranted, sat down, and the gentleman was so graceful and kind. He stood up and he said, I apologize if there's anything I've said that has given you the wrong impression. I'm glad that we have this forum where people can express themselves and so on, and I'd be very happy to answer any of the questions of why I think technology is here to stay in the classroom and how it affects libraries and so on. He was just the epitome of grace under pressure. Well, about a year later, I was called back to the State Library to do some consulting, and one of the things they were looking for was a new children's library consultant. And guess who one of the people who was applying was the lady who had stood up in the room. And the consensus of the group, and I just watched, I was just there facilitating, was that she had the right to say whatever she wanted, but there were 100 ways that she could have said it more professionally, and she could actually have had a private meeting with the state legislature instead of doing what she did. It was not appropriate for the time or place. She did what we call a drive-by, where she yelled at the guy and sat down, and time did not allow further dialogue and so on. And the consensus of the group was, we don't want to hire a loose cannon. So even though her skills as a children's librarian and consultant were acknowledged as to be superior, the group said, we don't want her here. And I always wondered that if she ever thought that standing up was going to be something that she might regret. I'm sure she never found out that that was the reason why she did not get the job. What that means to do things. So again, I'm going to stop here for a moment as we head into the final part and see if Jamie has any questions for me.
There was a question that came in, but before we get to that, I just wanted to mention you asked for some qualities to add to that slide, and I did add a bunch of those to the chat box, and some people said, team player, thinking on the go, going along with the proactivity, being upbeat and positive. I would say a sense of humor can get you through many situations, being
Yes.
flexible and willing to adapt to new roles. The question, Pat, goes back to slide 11, I believe, when you were talking about understatements and exaggerations. And Trixine asks, can Pat give us an example of understatement rather than exaggeration in a library situation?
Let's say that there really is kind of an outburst at the library where you're having a meeting and several people stand up and are very upset and people are screaming at each other and so on. And a reasonable person walking into the room as an objective observer might say, yes, I can honestly say people were screaming at each other. Well, instead of saying people were screaming at each other, you could say, I believe I could tell that people were upset and people exchanged fairly heated words about the situation. That doesn't sound quite as exciting as people were yelling and screaming at each other. We're not writing a movie script. We're not writing a fictional novel. We're not trying to add to what's going on. So let's find more neutral words to describe what's going on.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So once we sort of are figuring out how we're going to talk about it, let's say we have to really now analyze the issue. Now, this is all stuff that everybody here knows, but I want you to spend as much time actually thinking and planning about what your response should be to the problem at hand as you would for anything that's important in life. Sometimes people say, for example, people spend more time buying a car than planning their financial future. That I watched one of my family members spend, and I am not exaggerating, 5 hours to buy a blouse. 5 hours, and I'm trembling talking about, the words come out. 5 hours because I timed her to buy a blouse and spent what I think is 30 minutes figuring out the trust for her estate. So let's do some research, and we've already referred to some of the research, kind of the who, what, where, why, what's really going on, what are the pros and cons, who are the people, what do the documents say, and what I'd like you to do is to write it down, to actually create yourself a little planning document. For some people, it might be a list of bullet points. For someone else, it might actually be a little journaling to help calm yourself down and look at it objectively. Writing it down sometimes helps you find holes in your research to see what you've left out and so on. So if it's important, write it down. Ask for real help. What we mean by real help is ask someone who is your consultant, advisor, friend of the family. Mom used to call it her think tank. She'd have to call her think tank. Real help means an assignment, not just an opinion. Ask, what should I do next? What should be the next step that I do? Not just a venting session. And once you start training people that if you are talking about something, you're asking for real help, not just talking out loud, it's going to increase your credibility. It flatters people in the best sense of the word to ask for help. And some people may just let you jabber on because they say, well, she doesn't really want to do anything differently. She just wants to yelp about what's going on. So don't yelp. Ask for real help. And then finally, there shouldn't just be one way to accomplish something. If you only have a couple of ways to accomplish something, it turns you into what my friend Jan calls a robot. But if you can enter a meeting or an encounter with someone or walk into a room, with the city council or the executive board of your library or the executive team or the people at the meeting and say, here's the problem as I see it, and here are 4 things I think we can do to make things better. Again, it builds your credibility. And by the way, it forces you to kind of look at the bigger picture that the problem may be part of as well. So what are some of the mistakes we have? One big mistake is we don't have the facts. We don't have the facts, just opinions and feelings. We flail, and flailing is when you're sitting in that room arguing with a group of people about something. And I tell people it's like being in a room full of ping pong balls flying off the shelves. That's, by the way, why, and I may say this again, I'd like to stand in front of a room that's problem solving with a big flip chart and we write things down. And we don't go to the second idea until we've addressed the first idea. One of the things we talk about a lot in our little business is the plan is in your head, there is no plan. So I don't take you seriously as someone who's trying to address a problem unless I see you starting to write things down. You don't ask for advice and help. Lone eagles usually are not effective problem solvers. You don't build a team. People who are lone eagles are not effective problem solvers. And then again, just relying on one strategy. You have that one thing you want to do. Well, what if that doesn't work? What's plan B? What's plan C? Late friend of ours, Peter McLaughlin, used to say, the leader is the last person in the room to run out of ideas. So the more strategies that you're able to create with the help of your friends, your team, your advisors, the more credibility you're going to have with the people who make decisions. Now we come down to this idea of who are the people who are going to fix the problem. And by the way, it's sometimes not obvious. It's sometimes not obvious who has the legal authority. We call this governance. And governance is basically who gets to make decisions, what decisions they get to make, how those decisions are made, and then who gets to implement those decisions, who gets to execute what goes on. I was working with a large library organization a few years ago, and I had very skilled leadership in the room. It was a national organization. And I asked the question, if you had a difficult decision to make and an action to take, do you believe right now that you would be confident that within 30 minutes or less you could find out who actually had the authority to make the decision that you wanted to be made? That you could find that out in 30 minutes. And you know what was sad? Only about 4 people in that room raised their hand. The vast majority of the people in the room, even though they were experienced employees and managers of that national organization, literally had no clue about who made decisions. So governance is about that. And again, it's not always obvious. Is it the HR department? Is it the city attorney? Is it the state legislature? Is it the attorney general's office? Is it the people down the street? I mean, who gets to make the decision? And again, the legality of that is very important because most of what we're talking about are publicly funded libraries. But even if you work for a private institution, finding out who gets to make decisions and what decisions they get to make are very important. The issue of how are decisions made really is about, is it one person's decision to make, or does there have to be a vote? And if there's a vote, is it a simple majority, 51%, or maybe what they call a supermajority? All those things need to be done. And then once the decision is made, who is responsible for executing the decision? So one of the games that we ask people to think about is, do you believe that you actually know the real organizational chart? And many people who've worked in libraries for many years think they know the real organizational chart, but trust me, they don't. So that's part of the research that you need to do. When I tell people about the myth of the committee, what I'm meaning is that every time there's a committee of some kind, or a board, or a cohort, or a task force, or a panel, usually there's 1 or 2 people on that particular group or committee who actually are the decision makers. Sometimes that committee is not a decision-making committee. They're what we call an advisory committee. And in some cases, yes, there is a split in the board or the group that's going to make the decision about the yeas and the nays. However, if you look closely, you realize that there really isn't a committee. What we have is a lot of individuals who have to make some hard decisions. So guess what? You often are not selling a committee on an idea. You're selling 7, 10, 12, 14 individuals, each one where you might have a different strategy as well. So don't think of the committee or the board who you might need to go to as some kind of big blob. You have to think about each individual and what you're going to do to be able to sell each of those individuals. Finally, what is it that they need to get the job done? And by the way, it's not always money. People have this idea that everything in the United States runs on money. I would disagree. But how do you make it as easy for them to say yes as possible? Some of us just use bribes, and bribe may be as simple as saying good morning to them, being interested in what they're doing, building rapport with the person. So I laugh when people say, well, I want everything to be done rationally. And I said, well, that doesn't work on this planet. This planet's about cream puffs. This planet, often people make decisions irrationally. And we want to make sure that you've got your facts, that you are the best employee they've ever had. But at the same time, we have to understand that, yes, we may have to do a little schmoozing to get people to say yes. When people say convince me, they're not just talking about the facts. They want people to be able to see, hear, and understand the world from their point of view. It means empathy. I want you, if I'm the one who's the decision maker, for you to know what my priorities are. How important is it to solve your problem? How can you make it more important to me? How does it address other things that I'm concerned about? Do you have a feeling for who I have to please? You know, I remember a library director in Colorado of a big suburban district standing up in front of her staff for a staff day a few years ago, and she had probably 350 staff members, and she stood up and said, you know the most important people I have to please? The board. If I don't please the board, this is Colorado. I'm out of a job tomorrow. This is an at-will state. I won't be here to help you, to help the customers, to help the community. For better or for worse, I have to please people too. We sometimes forget that no matter how high you are in the food chain, there's someone higher. And what are my selling points? What's important to me? What is it that I care about? Am I the kind of person you can sell because you're going to offer me a solution that saves me money and time? Is it going to build my credibility? Is it going to make me look like a good guy? Will I get my name in the paper? There's all sorts of reasons that people are going to say yes to you, but each individual has a different reason. Here's a little list that you have in your handout, about some of the selling points that people might have, why they might want to say yes to you. So I hope that you start thinking about what your next steps are to solve the problem. I have a little list of some books here, and those of you who've taken my programs over the years will recognize these books. Most of them have been in print for many, many years. The authors are quite prolific. With one exception, all of the authors on this list are still alive. They're still actively writing, and they have many, many books in print. So if you can't find one of these books, please look at some of the others. And I would definitely say Becoming a Manager, Linda Hill's book, is really important to help you think like a problem solver. We don't charge for phone or email consultations, so if you have questions or comments, very happy to hear these from you, and I will turn things back over to Jamie.
Thank you so much, Pat. We did have a question come in, and that's about all we have time for, which is okay. And someone asked, I appreciate Pat's example of the children's librarian interaction with the state rep. Does she have any suggestions about how to teach librarians not to do this? I see this with experienced professionals as well as new professionals.
I, by the way, have no power of authority with my friends and clients and so on. I usually will do the quiet chat. I will actually find that I need to point out to people quietly why it's inappropriate. I send a lot of private messages on Facebook to friends in the library community basically saying why I felt what they posted was inappropriate for their career. And you know what? 99% of the time they take it seriously, but that's because I've tried to build credibility with them.
Great. Well, Pat, one thing I'm asking everybody, and I know you're not a librarian, but you work a lot with libraries and librarians, and what do you see most exciting about happening in libraries right now, or what do you think could be exciting in the future for libraries?
I would say, and this has been going on for decades, but I love community partnerships. I like when I see a library coming up with ideas of how to do joint programs with hospitals, with school districts, with businesses, with unexpected nonprofits and organizations to build the library's reach in the community outside the walls of the library, and that's what excites me the most.
Thank you. Just want to remind all of you that the slides for Pat's presentation are already up on our website, wildwhiskWinterweb.com, and her recording will be made available later today. Our next session is coming up at 10:30, what you need to know about library technology, so maybe I will see some of you at that. Thank you, Pat, so much for this excellent presentation, and I want to thank all of you for listening in, for your questions, for your comments, and I hope to see you at another session today. If not, thank you for participating. So long.